Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit in Western PA whose mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. You can find out everything there is to know about the Veterans Breakfast Club on our website, www.veteransbreakfastclub.org. Welcome to VBC's first episode of Lioness the Origin Story, a special 8-part podcast where Lioness Vets and those who know the history of the Lioness program discuss Taylor Sheridan's new show, Special Ops Lioness, through the lens of their experience. I'm happy to be co-hosting this special series with Daria Sommers and Shannon Morgan, two women who in different ways were involved with the Lioness origin story. In 2003, filmmaker and writer Daria Sommers watched reports of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and was struck by the fact that it wasn't just young men who were fighting, it was young women too, wives, mothers, sisters, daughters. It quickly became clear to her and her filmmaking colleague Meg McLagan that the official U.S. policy banning female soldiers from serving in direct ground combat was being severely tested, if not violated, on a regular basis. Their 2008 documentary, Lioness, reveals the history of a group of women support soldiers who went to Iraq in 2003 as mechanics, clerks, and engineers, but ended up serving as the original Lioness soldiers. Although the Lionesses' mission was to diffuse tensions with Iraqi women and children, they fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the Iraq War. And Shannon Morgan was a member of that original group of Lioness soldiers, an Army mechanic from Mena, Arkansas. She served in Ramadi from 2003 to 2004. During the 2004 battle for Ramadi, she was one of a group of Army Lioness soldiers attached to the 2-4 Marines during house-to-house searches. Impressed by her abilities, the Marines made her a saw gunner. That put her at the center of some of the fiercest street fighting of the war. But because of the combat exclusion policy, when Shannon returned home, she had to fight to get the full extent of her service recognized and receive the benefits she was entitled to as a combat veteran. With the goal of helping others, Shannon recently launched Operation Lioness, a social support network for women, women veterans, moms, military wives, war veterans, and men seeking positive change. The organization's goal is to provide a safe space for people to connect and support one another on their journey to rehabilitation and recovery. You can check out that website, operationlioness.org. I encourage you to visit that website, and I am very honored to introduce both Daria Sommers and Shannon Morgan. Thank you so much for being a part of the podcast today.
Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you also to Todd of the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're just delighted that you made space for us to do this podcast. And thanks to my buddy Shannon, who as a filmmaker, Shannon was one of the first Lioness soldiers I was able to track down in Mena, Arkansas, when Meg and I began our journey on making this film. And this is when we first heard, this was, wow, almost 20 years ago, 18 years ago, when we first heard about the Lioness program, and we decided that we wanted that to be the subject of our documentary. And I think, but fast forward to today, I think one of I think it's important to note that one of the reasons that Shannon and I began talking about trying to do something in response to Taylor Sheridan's show, Special Ops Lioness, is because what they're talking about is something that really evolved over time. And his show is like the end point, or the point today. And what the program that Shannon was in was the very beginning of it. And so we thought it would be really interesting to look at what sort of Hollywood is presenting as a television show through the lens of the women who actually served, especially in the earliest iterations of Lioness. And because I know sometimes it's difficult, and Shannon, you can chime in on this, when and I did notice in the first episode, which is what we're going to be talking about today, that they give the title, even though they call it Special Ops Lioness, when you watch the program, the title is simply Lioness, as it is in the documentary. And I know that there are many women who served as Lioness, who you're in touch with, Shannon, who were concerned about how the history was being told. Can you tell us a little bit about how you reacted when you first found out the show was being made, Shannon?
Absolutely. Well, myself and my fellow counterparts, we have our own group discussion, and without giving away too much, we kind of all feel in solidarity that once again, yet again, we're being left out. Lioness was a program that was created by the Army, by our colonel in 2003. And all of us kind of feel the same way as we're being slighted once again. Now, Lioness, Taylor Sheridan's project, has turned it into a Marine and CIA mission. We all agree that it's important to remember the origin of Lioness and where it came from, and it came from the Army. And we all just kind of feel the same at being slighted yet again.
Well, and I think that the one thing that we have going for us is that we have our affiliation now with the Veterans Breakfast Club, where storytelling veterans stories is what they do. And so now we have the opportunity to have this platform so that the original Lioness stories can be told and offer a frame for the show, because it's, on the one hand, it's great to have a show that at least at this point by name seems to recognize and apparently is like the sort of end point iteration of what started out in 2003, which actually makes this the 20th anniversary year of the start of the Lioness program. But and I don't know if you remember this, Shannon, but when we interviewed Colonel David Brinkley, your CEO, commander of the 1st Engineer Battalion, am I correct?
Yes, battalion commander. Yes, ma'am.
Battalion commander. This whole thing began because he was in the mess hall having, he said, milk and cookies with Lieutenant Colonel Cabri from the 1st Infantry Division, and they were saying what a problem they had when they would meet up with Iraqi women and children because of the cultural norms. They couldn't interact with them. And at that point, you had finished building, your team was out there to build and set up operations around Ramadi, right? And so you were more or less finished. And so Colonel Brinkley said, hey, I can loan out some of my women support soldiers. And Lieutenant Colonel Cabri said, great. And they said, let's call them Team Lioness. And I think that was the start. And they were having milk and cookies. And that's how it all began.
Right. Well, it's above my pay grade. What brass does, they just get together and kind of come up with things. But that's originally how they came up with Team Lioness. Yes.
And you weren't actually called Lioness to start. They found that title. It was something different to start. It wasn't as good of a title as Lioness.
Right. At first, they tossed around the idea of calling us Shield Maidens.
Yeah, I don't like that.
Not at all. None of us did. We were all kind of like, boo.
That doesn't really get the blood flowing.
Right. I heard it comes from some sort of Viking descent. I don't know what we were going for there, but I'm glad they went with Team Lioness and it stuck.
I want to take another sort of step further back and hear about why you decided to join the Army.
Yeah. Where I come from, it's a little tiny small town, about 5,200 people. And it's very Southern Baptist. I grew up a Southern Baptist in church every week with my parents. You really kind of have not a ton of choices. You can either go to college and get your degree if you have money to do that, if your family does, or you become a housewife and have children. which that's a noble job right there. I mean, without moms, where would we be? Where would we be? But there wasn't a lot of options, and when 9/11 happened, that was I already felt a calling to be a part of the military before that, but especially when 9/11 happened, I knew I had to run to the nearest recruiting station and get signed up as soon as I could. I felt a drive, and I felt compelled as an American to go do my part to help defend our country, to make sure nothing like that happened on American soil again. Say my main driving force was to, have that calling as an American to defend your country, and also so I could go to college because my parents didn't have a lot of money to pay for college.
And for our listeners,
You know,
you'll find out a lot more about Shannon's background if you check out Daria's Lioness documentary. And
yes, and I guess that we'll get that up on the Operation Lioness website, and also at the VBC website. But this is a good segue into the episode 1, your background and what motivated you to join up. Because in episode 1, which is called Sacrificial Soldiers and is written by Taylor Sheridan himself and directed by John Hillcoat. So, men writing and directing this history, which is really a history of women. But anyway, it starts out in Kobane, Syria. An undercover CIA woman in a burqa who is undercover with ISIS fighters her cover's blown, and there's a crisis. Zoe Saldana, who plays Jo, is trying to save her, but in the end, they just have to blow up the whole compound where the ISIS soldiers are. So the idea being Zoe Saldana, whose character is Jo, needs to get a replacement operative. And so then they go directly into the story of a young woman who is known as Cruz. And she's in Oklahoma City. And in a concentrated amount of time, she's got no family to speak of. Her father's gone, her mother's dead, a brother's in jail, and she's living with an abusive boyfriend. I mean, like, her situation could not be worse in terms of options. And her boyfriend, is very abusive and hits her, and she hits him back, and then he runs after her, and she runs into basically a Marine training center, which is a bit over the top, but I think in that one scene, he's really, they're making the point, I think, that a lot of young people enter the military when the options that they have are not particularly inspiring, and they want to they have the idea that they want to make more of their lives. Can you speak to that at all, Shannon? Because it felt a little bit like that was, people you want to serve your country, but you also want to make something of yourself.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
In your case, to go to college.
Right. Absolutely. I think geographically, when you come from a small town and there are limited choices, you really have just a few options. In Mena, you can work at local mom and pop shops, or you can work at like Tyson Factory at the chicken plant. I mean, there's a lot of factory work and stuff like that around Mena, but the options are very limited. And like I said, I knew from a very young age that I didn't want to be one of those barefoot, pregnant in the kitchen kind of women. I just knew that I always felt like my calling was more than that, and I come from a very strong military family. A lot of my family members served. My adopted father, who raised me, was a decorated World War II veteran. And I knew that with limited options, I had to go out and make my own options. And Uncle Sam was right there, arms open, ready to take me.
Did you think whenever you enlisted that you would see combat?
No, I knew that, yeah, more than likely we would deploy. I mean, that was just a given. But I thought as a female, seeing that DoD policy prevents females from engaging in frontline combat and it did, from being in frontline combat and from being attached to direct ground combat units. I really, really, really thought the likelihood of me actually being outside the wire running with my male counterparts, yeah, I didn't think that would ever happen.
Well, I think that's a really critical thing to mention is that women who join the military, especially at the start of the Iraq War, just after 9/11, joined, and I think we can say this is true for the other women in your unit, like Nava and even Colonel, she's a colonel now, Colonel Breslow, Anastasia Breslow, weren't expecting to go outside the wire because you were basically part of like an engineering unit, which was a support unit.
We're support, correct.
Yeah, right. And even Rebecca Nava, who we both know well, was a desk clerk. And so that was just probably something you never expected at all.
No, none of us.
So in the show, when Cruz enters, what did you think of that scene? Because I just thought it was kind of over the top, but kind of funny at the same time, even though it was not funny, it was very serious. When Cruz's boyfriend is chasing her and she runs into the
recruiting station.
The only door that's open is the Marine recruiting station. And the boyfriend says, it's a problem between me and her. And the big Marine says, not anymore. Now it's between you and the United States Marine Corps. And okay, even the boyfriend, who is like abusive and basically you're led to believe he's ready to kill her. Okay, the Marine stops him cold. So I just thought, well, that's like a Marine recruiting ad.
For sure. I'm still confused as to why the Army recruiting office door was locked. I don't know. I mean,
right.
Hey.
It's a good point.
Yeah. It's very interesting because both the Army and the Marines offer soldiers who go into special ops and CIA work, I think. I'm not sure it's just Marines, but I guess it's that whole thing where the Marines are the front line of the front line.
Tip of the
First
spear,
in, last out. I think they go. Yeah, that's their working theory.
And I guess the one thing about her Cruz's Marine training is that her competence is revealed to be so extreme. It's almost like she's like beyond the other women and beyond the men. She's like a superhuman. Because when we made the documentary, one of the things that we were very impressed by and were really educated on was the competency that all of you in the Lioness program, the ones that were in the film and even the ones who weren't, impressed us that there was just you were so competent, and you had to rise to the occasion. And it was just, and it wasn't about being superhuman. It was about stepping into the moment and rising to the occasion in sort of an unprecedented way, because not only were you outside the wire, you were outside of the wire in the most extreme situations that even the Marines would have found extreme and did find extreme. So I was just wondering what the reaction was to the fact that they had to make Cruz, in order to play this role, she had to be so superhuman.
Well, I think it goes along and coincides with how females just in general are actually looked at in the military, because as a female, you not only prove yourself once, that you can hold your own, but then they throw you into combat situations like that and you have to prove yourself yet again. It never stops and it really never ends. So for them to lead with her being superhuman like that, I mean, that doesn't surprise me at all. You have to give a strong character to back up a strong role like that.
Well, so in a way, you were that worked for you.
I mean, none of us, I mean, we literally were thrown into some situations with hardly any training. Like the Marines state in the Lioness documentary, they had already assumed we had been trained in combat arms, and that was the whole issue with it. We had literally had zero to very little training. We were just thrown into the mix and expected to excel, which brings me back to we're always proving ourselves, you know. I don't feel like our male counterparts ever were engaged in that same scenario because they were sent in with the adequate training, and because you're a male, you're automatically given an in into the boys club because you are a boy. So
Right.
You all had to work twice as hard.
Oh, correct. Yeah. It never stopped. I mean, even when you do prove yourself, they'll come up with something else. They're like, well, she did that great, but. So for them to lead in this show in Lioness Special Ops with Cruz being a superhuman female right out the gate, I mean, that doesn't surprise me whatsoever. And for them to make it where the Marine female, she comes in perfect right out the gate, that must be nice because that didn't happen with the Army when we started it.
This is the somewhat Hollywoodization of the story.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
Right. We can't spend 3 episodes setting up Cruz and training her. We need her to be, a superhuman to start. And this is why we're going to give her the backstory of what's made her so hardened, what's made her stronger. She did track in high school, and she comes in and she crushes it in basic. Now, Shannon, you from the Lioness documentary, you were an excellent marksman.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
When the Marines decided to have you be the saw gunner, how did that come about?
That's what I was trained with the Army, trained as a saw gunner. I was already a saw gunner when I went to the Marines. They were shocked. They had never seen a female carrying a squad automatic weapon. The only saw gunners were males. So that was brand new to them. So even though I showed up with, I'm going to put it in layman's terms here, even though I showed up with a big machine gun, I still had to prove myself again and continuously prove myself.
Wow.
And that's difficult enough, just in that situation. And again, referring back to the documentary, you had to fight differently with the Marines. So not only had you been trained in the Army, and yes, you already had the acumen for sharpshooter, and you had been trained on the saw, you kind of knew what the Army expected of you in a combat situation, somewhat. Then you go to the Marines, and it's a completely new ballgame, a completely different book.
Right, correct. I just assume that the Army, I can't, I've been with both counterparts. I'm not going to speak on Marine training or how they do things, but, with the little training that we did have was with the Army. It was with 1-5 Field Artillery Unit, and they just they conduct cordon searches differently than Marines do. So yeah, there was, we use different lingo, and apparently we use different search and seizure tactics.
But that was not, I mean, things moved on the ground so quickly in terms of, first you were being loaned out to the Lieutenant Colonel Cabry's first.
Right, with Army 1-5 Field Artillery.
Yeah, in the Army, and so that was one thing, and those missions were more benign, so to speak. But
Correct.
Once you were sent out with the Marines, that because they just asked to borrow you because they heard about you, the 2-4 Marines, and you went out with them. But that happened rather quickly, so there wasn't time for any. No one really thought about any special training or the different language and communication. Gaps that might occur between the Army and the Marines, right?
Right, because I think it was Colonel Brinkley's understanding when we ended up getting attached to the Marines, that we would carry on the same kind of peacekeeping missions and high value target searches that we were doing with 1-5 Field Artillery. I don't think that Colonel Brinkley or Captain Pendry, now Major Guntorson, I don't think either one of them actually expected us to be attached to these stack teams in direct ground combat, running with them in the streets. Nobody seen that coming.
Nobody did. Well, that's just sort of one of the most that's like this key turning point, not just in for you and for the women that were attached to the 2-4 Marines, but just that one moment, Shannon, I'm not sure most people sort of understand this in context, was a turning point really for the history of women in the military. Because it just sort of, and which is not to say that in the past, no women service members were ever in combat, because of course that's not true.
Absolutely. They've always.
Because that definitely happened, but in sort of like mainstreamed purposefully into the fight, you know, in such a way that was disconnected from what everyone thought was going on back home, and certainly with the politicians and the Department of Defense, had basically, this was boots on the ground decision making versus, you know, whatever policy they had back home was like a fantasy at this point, because you were doing what needed to be done. And I think that's one of the things that people have to understand, that made this a turning point.
Right. And then the Army Times came out with a article about it, and all the people that were busy denying that it wasn't happening had to take accountability for that, because they done published an article. So that's where bringing women to the forefront and backing us up, saying, oh no, yeah, we are out here doing this. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, there was even the History Channel documentary that didn't say anything about the Lionesses in Ramadi.
No, they purposefully left that out, I feel like, because a lot of people were scrambling, like me and Daria said in the beginning. It's against DoD policy at that time for women to be attached to direct ground combat units, and that's exactly where we were. So somebody had to answer for that, and I think it made a lot of people nervous. They were trying to cover it up versus bring light to it.
Now, I heard a story from someone who would definitely be in the position to know, high up, that a phone call came in to the Marine headquarters in Ramadi, and it was General Mattis. And after one of your firefights, he was like, who's that female saw gunner from the Army hanging out with the Marines? Who can shoot so well? What the hell is she doing? And so that was General Mattis. Somehow he had heard about it. I don't know exactly where he was at the time, but you could definitely see it was making people nervous. But so just getting back to Taylor Sheridan's show, none of this is making them nervous at this point. They're all trained for it. So one of I thought it was very interesting when Joe goes to find a replacement for undercover operative she lost. She sees Cruz, you know, it's all set up so that she's going to say, well, Cruz is definitely the one, you know, the replacement I want. So she's picking a new asset. Joe's picking a new asset. And so that's about 28 minutes into the show. At that point, and I have no idea if anyone in the process of making this show saw our documentary, saw your story and the story of the other Lionesses in it, but at about 28 minutes in, the Zoe Saldana character, who is Joe, gives the briefest of brief explanations about the Lioness program, and I kind of
Right.
jotted it down. She said, when Team Lioness was first formed, we just needed female soldiers to frisk and interrogate female insurgents. We can't have a man running his hand over some Muslim teenager's groin, but it, meaning the program, has evolved. And what we do now is we locate the wives, daughters of high-value targets, and we place operatives close to them. And so what she's describing is this evolution. I mean, she's just jumping ahead. And so that is the Lioness program that was taken up by the CIA. But in between that, there was the Army Lionesses, which you were a part of, that were the first iteration. You were the original. There were different generations. And then around 2007, 2008, the Marines decided they could train their Marine women, and they have a Marine Lionesses. By 2010, especially when they were in Helmand Province, they had evolved into female engagement teams.
Correct.
And I think it was the inspiration of the female engagement teams at that point that the CIA got wind of, and then reverted back to calling them Lioness. So I think it's just important to point out where you were and your role in that history. But
I think that scene that you're talking about in Lioness Special Ops, where she briefly gives a blip description history of Lioness and its origins, I think like that would have been a special moment right there for Taylor Sheridan and the other people of the show to be like, hey, this is where Lioness originated from. No, we're happy to see all females being lifted up, females in the military in general. I mean, this is amazing, but let's give credit due where it belongs, because just like the History Channel show, once again, we feel like it's, you're sliding the Army, and the Army's you're just sliding all of us by not giving that recognition. I mean, that's amazing that the CIA turned it into an operation and it continues, but let's not forget the true history and where it came from.
You're absolutely right, Shannon. And I think, and it's the Army started it, and then also the Marines, female Marines were trained in the program. And like all those women, starting with the Army, starting with the Marines, starting with the Marine female engagement teams, because the thing about the Marine female engagement teams, they would be sent out to interact with women and children, and they would have a medic with them. They would try to help. There was a lot of cultural outreach in a way, and they were trying to open of communication, and it wasn't all kind of like it wasn't all confrontations and conflict. They were trying to open pathways. And I do remember talking to some female engagement team members, and this was I think in 2009, 2010, and they were still saying they were periodically called back because the combat exclusion policy was still in effect, and they could never decide. Like whenever anybody got nervous about it, they were all called back to base. And so it was this, you are, you aren't, you are, you aren't, sort of, they couldn't decide what was the role of females, of women. And so, yeah, they do include that brief description of the history, but it's really not enough.
It's really not. I would be highly surprised to say that Mr. Sheridan hasn't seen that documentary, because there's just a couple things in his show that caught my eye. One scene where Cruz had been kidnapped by her own people and was put into a little training test scenario there. And her abductor and her get into it, and she kicks him right in the crotch. And I thought, well, dadgum, I know somebody who did something like that.
Right, that's right, Shannon. And we're going to talk about that more when we do episode 2. And I know exactly what you're talking.
Yeah.
You mentioned a good point, because I think you wrote a scene for him.
Yeah, right. Possibly, I don't know.
I think you did, because I'm not sure.
I think.
Not sure he would have come up with it quite on his own.
Right.
That's just my opinion.
Yeah, just opinions.
As a civilian myself and watching the show, and I'm a big fan of people who may watch my podcast, The Scuttlebutt, through the Veterans Breakfast Club. I've talked about how much I'm a fan of these sort of the stories of like James Bond, Jason Bourne. I love those stories. But what I'm really liking about the Special Ops Lioness program is that it's bringing really strong female characters to the forefront. I really, if I would say, like, the most enjoyable piece of this first episode was watching Zoe and Lesla portray these characters. I think they're doing a fantastic job acting the roles, which are not easy roles. Another thing I was enjoying about it is that there's a price for what these women have gone through and what they are going through.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I hope that we can, over the course of this 8-part miniseries, sort of dive into a bit with all of the Lionesses, is that, there's a price for this. And how is that being portrayed in the show? Is it truthful? And it's something that we've talked about on my Scuttlebutt podcast, is the legacy of post 9/11 vets. And we don't want that legacy to be mental health. Yes, like we said, there's
Absolutely.
a price, there is trauma that goes along with combat, but there is also strength, and there is also sacrifice, and there is also hope. So did you feel, Shannon, in watching this first episode, that those things are being portrayed in a way that makes sense and that is truthful?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of truth to it, Sean. The part that most people miss as a female, like I've said, you're expected to prove yourself over and over and over again. But here's the real deal about it. Especially because we were thrown into combat situations, and myself and my other fellow Lionesses never had a chance to process even what we went through, because when you come home, you're just expected to jump right back into your role as a civilian, do your civilian job, and you're expected to pick up the pieces and be a mom. A lot of these females don't even have a chance to degress or even decompress whatsoever. We're always held to a higher standard, and it seems like proving yourself as a female just never stops. There's no time to gauge anything, and there's no downtime for you to go over and process what you've just been through. And I think like in the series Special Ops, where Joe has to send the Reaper in and take out her own asset. I mean, and then it shows her, you see her, she goes home right afterwards, she has a little bit of a debriefing, and then she goes home and her husband's like, "Are you hungry? I made dinner," and she has to just jump right back into the role of being a mom and act like nothing has happened. I mean, I understand that male counterparts do that too, but it just seems like everybody wants to shine a light on females and be like, well, look, we let them into combat and now they have problems. They're weak. No, we're not weak. We're just like everyone else. We just process things differently. And actually, a lot of the moms that come home don't even have time to process. They have to jump right back into their regular roles.
I think that's absolutely right, Shannon. And it is just, again, you and Sean just bring up a good point, because it is interesting. Taylor Sheridan does address that. Joe goes home, her older daughter is like, "What are you doing here? What's she doing here?" And the younger daughter jumps up and hugs her. And I mean, we've all seen online, whether it's
and her husband's like, you didn't call before you came home. I mean, come on.
Yeah, exactly. Like I
like,
had to
did you need
them.
time to prepare for me going through what I just went through today?
Yeah, but contrast that to all the videos that are just heartwarming, where the father, returns home, he's still in uniform, and he shows up at his kid's class, and the kid just runs up and it's like, Daddy, and you don't. There's not that embrace going on here, and I know it's complicated for both genders, and I'm not going to say it's not complicated for fathers as well. It is.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But it is interesting because I also feel by setting up Cruz, it's like Cruz is set up as the antithesis to what Joe goes through, because she's not married, she doesn't have a boyfriend, she has no family, she has no children, so she's suddenly the perfect asset. You can see they set it up that way. Whereas I think over the course of the series, and I hope we'll learn more about, how Joe works the relationship with her family. Clearly part of it is that they have an open marriage, and she's kind of cool with it, which let's see how that plays out.
It further plays on that oxymoron. They didn't want to let females into the boys club, be infantry and stuff, because we were seen as weak, but yet we go out and we do these things and we hold our own and we come home and we deal and we process, but you still can't be weak again because you just undid everything.
Right.
No time.
No, absolutely. You have to come home and be strong, and it just never ends. I want to talk about, we didn't see a lot of it, and hopefully in episode 2, episode 3, the ensuing episodes, there are only 8 in this one. But Jill Wagner's character as part of the team, didn't she bring the original idea for this show to Taylor Sheridan?
Yeah, that's what the backstory is that I've been hearing on the internet. Is however much truth there is to that. But it was Jill and her husband, who was a officer in the U.S. Army Reserves.
So he had information on the CIA program, and he was able to at least have some degree of knowledge such that they could pitch it as a show.
Yeah, I'm assuming so. He was an officer, like I mentioned, so that's above my pay grade. He's got access to more information than all of us.
And I thought it was interesting on the plane when Joe and Cruz are discussing the assignment, and that's come up, and they're flying to they're flying to Kuwait, and
Camp Air John.
Right, and Cruz clearly is trying to form a little bit more of a bond, and Joe is like, no, we're not friends, don't do that. And she's like, well, but what if my cover's blown and you have to save me? And Joe is like, no,
he needs to believe in her. Yeah,
and then I'll help you, but you have to save yourself first.
Right.
And
I think that was a big statement, because that kind of speaks on females in the military in general. You kind of have to save yourself and be your own hero.
Well, that made me think of you, Shannon. Because you saved yourself at that key moment. Yes. All hell was breaking loose in your body. You want to recap a little bit of that for us?
Well, that is definitely one of my top scariest moments over there. I was at the back of the stack team, and I got left behind, and I found myself pinned down in the middle of a firefight. And the only thing outside of the rounds I could hear was Rainey on a rooftop screaming at me, directed me, trying to get me to her to get out of the pinch point I was pinned in. So at that moment in time, I kind of had to be my own hero too, Daria. Yes.
You know, Shannon, I saw that scene and I thought, you know, it's not even theoretical for Shannon Morgan. She did that. She did it years ago, and she wasn't just talking about it on a plane, because it also has to do with, you know, and now we're nearing the end of the first episode, when the assignment comes in, Joe and calls Cruz, they have to get sort of all dressed up, get in their hijabs, and they're going to go out. And basically, this is Cruz's launch as an operative. And Joe explains to her, you do need to go in blind. And and at this point, we're just talking about into the jewelry store, but it's basically undercover, so it has a lot of there's a lot of tension, and she has to be in a certain headspace to be able to do this. And it's the beginning of her mission as an undercover operative. But I mean, I just feel like that idea of going in blind is something that, at the original iteration of Lioness Soldiers, you guys did a lot, because as much as Colonel Brinkley and Captain Pendry, who is now Guttormson, you know, talked to you and briefed you, it was still just something that really hadn't been done before.
Right. There were a lot of mistakes made, and I'm glad to see that the Army and the Marines have corrected that. You know, they've stepped up training. They give direct training for these females. They're actually taken to the side and trained separately now for these said scenarios. And I mean, I understand that there always has to be a baseline, but I also feel like, again, Taylor Sheridan gave a little bit of a nod again to the origin of Lioness, especially in that moment. You know, she's like, I don't understand what to do. I don't even know where to go. And she's like, you'll be fine. You know, I mean, I feel like that's, again, another little nod for the lack of training.
Right. And that's his expression of it in his narrative.
Right.
In this show. Well, you know, Shannon, you're convincing me a little bit, like maybe Taylor Sheridan and some of the people working on Lioness Special Ops did actually watch our documentary, and that they did take away some of that, some of the information in there, and put it in the show. It would be nice to know. And for you guys, for the women in the show, and the women, all of the women, even those who were not in the film, because we couldn't include everyone, but the other Lioness, especially in the first generation, it would be lovely to have the show acknowledge the documentary. But certainly
Absolutely.
it's fun to kind of do the detective work and see where we find the connections. So
Absolutely.
I think that comes to the end of our first episode on this, and just reviewing. So the series first episode, I do hope, I will say, and I'd love to hear what you think, Shannon, and also Sean. Love to hear what you think, but the origin story for Taylor Sheridan's Yellowstone, which is the 1883 series that stars Faith Hill and Tim McGraw. One of the reasons why I'm referring to it, because that's really the origin story he calls that the origin story for Yellowstone, and which is why I love we can call this the origin story for Lioness Special Ops Lioness, well, however they're calling it. So we're his origin story for his new show. However, but in that I thought I really loved his main character of the young 17-year-old woman who was the daughter of the Tim McGraw and Faith Hill characters. She's played by the name Isabel May, and she's 17. She's kind of a free, wild, untamed spirit, and then she becomes the voice of the 1923 show to some extent. But I just thought, well, that he crafted a really wonderful female character, and he's able to do that. And I hope that in this show that some of the other characters, especially the character Jill Wagner plays and Zoe, that we can see them expand and we can get a more nuanced representation of all of them as women and human beings.
Absolutely. And I hope they don't continue to exploit women's weaknesses right out the gate. It's diminishing, and we all agree on that.
Absolutely. We all agree on that. And because I think there's something when you start, I mean, it's one thing when you're telling, I guess, the stories about the Wild West and the or the expansion westward, and that's one headset. But somehow when you get into a military type story, people tend to kind of fall back a little bit into cliche or types. So I hope, and I believe, I've got my fingers crossed that the writing will emancipate us from the cliches and give these potentially wonderful characters, something to work with. And
yes.
Anyway, that's what I think.
The potential for a beautiful series is there if you can maintain female role integrity and not destroy our view right out the gate. I mean, somehow sexual exploitation always makes its way in Hollywood films, and I just don't want that to take away from what females have achieved and what they are doing and continue to do, because that is very cliche, Daria.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And it would be such a relief not to have to deal with that.
Absolutely. Just once we want to see something like that.
That's right.
Lioness is a strong term, and be careful with it because you're borrowing that name, Mr. Sheridan.
Right. And I'll just say, but for sure, Shannon, that all the women who served as lionesses, there's a lot of history in that name that's already been lived, blood that's been shed,
Lives
trauma,
lost, yes,
and also real strength and character born.
Absolutely.
And so, just remember that. I mean, the shows are already written, so I guess we're just saying what we think, but
well, bouncing off that idea, this idea of history, Shannon, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because I know that nobody enters the military for the accolades, but given a long history of women serving, and I talk from sort of Veterans Breakfast Club in our network, we have a 102-year-old Navy wave who served during World War II, helped to decode Enigma.
Yeah.
And an incredible story that she has. Growing up in Mena, Arkansas, and like you said, there weren't many options available to you. You join the Army, you don't even think you're going to see combat. Now, all of a sudden, you're a part of history, whether you like it or not. You helped change the course of women in the military and break this glass ceiling. And I kind of want to hear your thoughts on what that means to you.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's very near and dear to my heart, Sean. I mean, it's important to me to always attempt to represent females in the best light possible. That was also a lot of my driving force for being a part of this documentary, and continuing on to Capitol Hill to help change DoD policy. Females are not entering the military for accolades like you mentioned. A lot of, I mean, I can only speak for myself personally. They came out with the combat action badge for females, which is similar to the combat infantry badge, which is, this is in the Army, which is given to infantry soldiers when they're in direct ground combat. I don't care about the accolades, but it was damn sure my mission to make sure and go on and fight for other females that came behind me, and to make sure that we were taken care of in the VA healthcare system too. But as far as accolades go, yeah, no, that's definitely not why I entered. But it is my mission to make sure that every female who has served as a lioness, it needs to be recorded in their DD 214 somewhere. That's one thing on policy we still haven't gotten addressed yet. And I would like there to be a Lioness service ribbon added to our U.S. service ribbons. Why not? It's an honor and a privilege to be chosen to be a lioness. Why shouldn't you be able to sport that on your Class A's?
And definitely, this is a great time to plug operationlioness.org. This is a great place for people to go and find out more information, correct?
Absolutely. And we add stuff to that website weekly. It's still in its infancy, but we're picking up and we're getting ready to gear up and turn it into a nonprofit organization. I'm working on that very soon.
Hopefully our listeners here, thank you so much for joining this podcast. And as your homework, it's watch Special Ops Lioness, but also look up Lioness, the documentary by Daria Sommers. Visit operationlioness.org. Daria, this has been an excellent hour. I will be dipping maybe back into the mini series here throughout, but I'm excited to keep listening and hearing more of the Lionesses stories as you continue to produce.
Great. And so in our next podcast, we'll review and go through episode 2. Thank you again, Sean, for the Veterans Breakfast Club helping to host this podcast. Timely, important, and again, this show hit on the almost the 20th anniversary exactly. It's because it's 2023 is the 20th anniversary year of the first Lioness mission, and I think it's the 10th anniversary of the lifting of the combat exclusion policy. And so There's a lot going on, and it just sort of all hit. So I think it's a good time, and thank you very much.
Our pleasure. We hope to our listeners look forward to our next episode, which, like Daria said, we'll cover episode 2 of Special Ops Lioness. Shannon, you'll be rejoining for that discussion as we continue to dive further into the Lioness history, into your service. And we'll look forward to having more Lionesses join the podcast throughout to talk about their service and their reactions to the show. Thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Shannon.